Hey guys, tonight we wander through the winding, stone-paved streets of early Ottoman Istanbul, where the scent of freshly roasted coffee drifts lazily in the air like an invisible invitation. You trudge past bustling stalls, feeling the cobbled streets uneven beneath your sandals, the chatter of merchants mingling with the soft clinking of brass coffee cups. Steam curls upward from tiny ceramic vessels, twisting into the air like a playful ghost of conversations yet to come. You probably won't survive this without at least spilling a little curiosity on the floor, because once the aroma hits your nose, there's no turning back. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Share your location and local time, too. It's always comforting to know someone else is trailing this caffeine-laden journey with you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets are narrow, twisting alleys lined with low, worn stone buildings, their walls darkened from years of fires and cooking smoke. You sidestep puddles, the faint reflection of lanterns shimmering, and pause when a distant rhythmic banging catches your ear, some apprentice at a coffee roaster hammering beans into powder, each thump a tiny heartbeat echoing through the alley. You inhale deeply, savoring the bitter sweetness in the air, the aroma so potent that it makes your tongue tingle and your stomach flutter. In these earliest coffee houses, the kahvehane, people gather not merely to drink, but to share news, debate, and occasionally plot little rebellions wrapped in laughter. Historians still argue whether these cafes acted more as political incubators or social safaris, but either way, the smell alone makes your steps light with anticipation. You drift inside one such establishment, a low-ceilinged room crowded with benches worn smooth by years of elbows, backs, and restless feet. The air is thick with smoke from narghiles and candles, interlaced with the nutty scent of ground coffee steeping in tiny copper chesves. You can feel the warmth instantly. It's almost tangible, like the walls themselves exhale comfort. Patrons glance at you, some with mild curiosity, others with the practiced indifference of habituation. A group of merchants hunch over a game of tavla, dice clattering, punctuated by bursts of laughter that ricochet off the walls. You realize quickly that every sound, every scent, every twitch of a foot has meaning here, a silent language of social rhythms coded into the very space of the cafehane. At the far corner, an elderly man, perhaps the poet or a scholar, leans toward a young apprentice and whispers something under his breath. The apprentice chuckles nervously, tilts his cup, and nods, hiding the fact that he's taken the advice seriously. You notice a pattern. Coffee houses are as much about mentorship and learning as they are about drinking. Scholars still debate whether the rise of coffee houses accelerated intellectual exchange in Ottoman cities more than formal madrasas did. But standing here, listening to the soft hum of conversation, it's hard to argue against it. And then there's the fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect. Some patrons supposedly sprinkled tiny amounts of crushed saffron or rose petals in their coffee to stimulate imagination, a practice whispered about in letters that occasionally surface in the odd archive. A young man strides in, carrying a small satchel of news from distant provinces. He sets down a folded paper on the counter and announces the day's events: a caravan delayed by rain, a minor skirmish near the Danube, the price of silk fluctuating unpredictably. You watch as the room responds. Merchants murmur, poets scribble lines inspired by the tidbit, and the old scholar's eyebrows raise ever so slightly. Coffee here isn't just a beverage, it's the catalyst for storytelling, debate, and even minor political speculation. You lean closer, inhaling the dense mixture of aromas, catching a fleeting note of cardamom in someone else's cup, and feel the tug of centuries-old rituals anchoring this moment to a broader history. Everywhere, the air hums with quiet energy. A boy dashes past, delivering small copper coins to pay for coffee, dodging elbows and low-hanging shelves. You watch, amused, as an older woman shakes her head but smiles. This chaos is ordinary here. In another corner, a man quietly sharpens a small knife to cut figs into perfect slivers. the faint metallic scrape blending into the low murmur of voices. You realize that a coffee house is a microcosm. Every gesture, every preparation, every gesture of politeness or mischief contributes to the overall rhythm. And of course, the aroma, the ever-present coffee scent, reminds you that in these spaces, your senses are both guests and guides. The conversations ripple around you like gentle waves. You drift toward a table where a cluster of poets argue softly over the proper cadence of a couplet. One leans back, stroking a thin beard, insisting that coffee, strong and black, opens the mind in ways water cannot. The other, younger, counters with a mischievous grin that it's the company, not the cup, that inspires brilliance. You quietly slide onto the edge of their bench, feeling your own pulse quicken in tandem with theirs. The air is a cocktail of anticipation, roasted beans, and just the faintest tang of sweat from the day's work. A stray cat, sleek and confident, weaves in between the benches, unbothered by the murmuring humans, a living punctuation to the evening's unfolding drama. Across the room, a group of merchants whispers in low tones, exchanging news and speculation. One produces a tiny scroll and the others lean in, cups raised, nodding as the information circulates. You hear snippets, a delayed caravan in the Levant, the sudden rise of a silk price in Bursa, a minor tax dispute at the docks. Traders like these are not merely selling goods, they are transferring intelligence, a currency almost as valuable as the coffee in their hands. Historians still argue whether the Coffeehouse functioned more as a social hub or a proto-newsroom, but the constant hum of whispered tidbits makes the latter hard to deny. A fringe rumor flits by your ear. Some traders supposedly coded their letters with coffee stain patterns to indicate urgency, an early version of coffee cryptography, if you will. You raise an eyebrow, tasting both skepticism and amusement with your next sip. You wander to the hearth, where a copper chesve simmers gently over coals. The aroma of cardamom and cloves mingles with the earthy scent of the beans. A young apprentice stirs carefully, his movements precise, almost reverent. You notice the tiny, deliberate gestures that mark mastery, the tilt of the handle, the arc of the pour, the measured foam that will crown the cup. Each action is a ritual, honed by generations. You take a deep breath, and the steam rises to kiss your cheeks. There's a subtle magic here, almost hypnotic, as if the air itself is charged with ideas, rumors, and subtle rebellion. A group in the back murmurs about politics, though no one says the word out loud. References to the Sultan, to tax collectors, to distant port cities are couched in anecdotes, parables, and dry jokes. You catch a sly smile exchanged between two patrons when someone quips about the man who rules from the Topkapi Palace without ever smelling coffee, and you realize that humor is a protective shell, a socially acceptable way to poke at authority. Scholars still debate whether these conversations genuinely influenced Ottoman governance or simply offered temporary mental escape, but the electricity in the air feels tangible, a tension offset by laughter and the comforting warmth of shared beverages. At a corner table, a Sufi mystic sits cross-legged, hands cupped around a steaming brew. His eyes close briefly as he inhales the fragrance, murmuring softly under his breath. He is not ignoring the room, he is listening differently, attuning to rhythms most would overlook. You creep closer, drawn by curiosity, and notice how he seems to treat the coffee as both object and conduit, a bridge between the earthy and the eternal. Fringe accounts claim some dervishes added saffron or rose petals to heighten spiritual insight. Whether truth or legend, you can almost believe it here. You sip your own cup and feel a strange stillness settle in your chest, a tiny doorway into a moment that might, in some small way, outlast the very walls that hold you. The hours stretch, elastic, as the cafe continues its soft symphony. Dice clatter, a lute hums faintly, and laughter weaves around arguments that grow increasingly philosophical. You notice a man sketching something in charcoal on a scrap of paper, pausing occasionally to stare at the foam of his coffee as if seeking inspiration from the swirls.
Historians still argue whether coffeehouses nurtured artistic creativity more than religious institutions did, but the intensity of focus around these low tables is undeniable. Patrons sip, murmur, scribble, and gesticulate, forming a choreography of social, intellectual, and sometimes absurd interactions. You feel part of it, and yet distinctly an observer, perched on the edge of centuries-old traditions that unfold as naturally as breathing.
Hey guys, tonight we wander through the winding, stone-paved streets of early Ottoman Istanbul, where the scent of freshly roasted coffee drifts lazily in the air like an invisible invitation. You trudge past bustling stalls, feeling the cobbled streets uneven beneath your sandals, the chatter of merchants mingling with the soft clinking of brass coffee cups. Steam curls upward from tiny ceramic vessels, twisting into the air like a playful ghost of conversations yet to come. You probably won't survive this without at least spilling a little curiosity on the floor, because once the aroma hits your nose, there's no turning back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Share your location and local time, too. It's always comforting to know someone else is trailing this caffeine-laden journey with you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets are narrow, twisting alleys lined with low, worn stone buildings, their walls darkened from years of fires and cooking smoke. You sidestep puddles, the faint reflection of lanterns shimmering, and pause when a distant, rhythmic banging catches your ear. Some apprentice at a coffee roaster hammering beans into powder, each thump a tiny heartbeat echoing through the alley. You inhale deeply, savoring the bitter sweetness in the air, the aroma so potent that it makes your tongue tingle and your stomach flutter. In these earliest coffee houses, the Coffeehouse, people gather not merely to drink, but to share news, debate, and occasionally plot little rebellions wrapped in laughter. Historians still argue whether these cafes acted more as political incubators or social safaris. But either way, the smell alone makes your steps light with anticipation. You drift inside one such establishment, a low-ceilinged room crowded with benches worn smooth by years of elbows, backs, and restless feet. The air is thick with smoke from nargilés and candles, interlaced with the nutty scent of ground coffee steeping in tiny copper chesves. You can feel the warmth instantly. It's almost tangible, like the walls themselves exhale comfort. Patrons glance at you, some with mild curiosity, others with the practiced indifference of habituation. A group of merchants hunch over a game of tavla, dice clattering, punctuated by bursts of laughter that ricochet off the walls. You realize quickly that every sound, every scent, every twitch of a foot has meaning here, a silent language of social rhythms coded into the very space of the Coffeehouse. At the far corner, an elderly man, perhaps a poet or a scholar, leans toward a young apprentice and whispers something under his breath. The apprentice chuckles nervously, tilts his cup and nods, hiding the fact that he's taken the advice seriously. You notice a pattern. Coffee houses are as much about mentorship and learning as they are about drinking. Scholars still argue whether the rise of coffee houses accelerated intellectual exchange in Ottoman cities more than formal madrasas did. But standing here, listening to the soft hum of conversation, it's hard to argue against it. And then there's the fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect. Some patrons supposedly sprinkled tiny amounts of crushed saffron or rose petals in their coffee to stimulate imagination, a practice whispered about in letters that occasionally surface in the odd archive. A young man strides in, carrying a small satchel of news from distant provinces. He sets down a folded paper on the counter and announces the day's events: a caravan delayed by rain, a minor skirmish near the Danube, the price of silk fluctuating unpredictably. You watch as the room responds. Merchants murmur, poets scribble lines inspired by the tidbit, and the old scholar's eyebrows raise ever so slightly. Coffee here isn't just a beverage,
It's the catalyst for storytelling, debate, and occasionally minor rebellions wrapped in laughter. Historians still argue whether the cafes acted more as political incubators or social safaris, but either way, the smell alone makes your steps light with anticipation. You drift inside one such establishment, a low-ceilinged room crowded with benches worn smooth by years of elbows, backs, and restless feet. The air is thick with smoke from nargilés and candles, interlaced with the nutty scent of ground coffee steeping in tiny copper chesves. You can feel the warmth instantly. It's almost tangible, like the walls themselves exhale comfort. Patrons glance at you, some with mild curiosity, others with the practiced indifference of habituation. A group of merchants hunch over a game of tavla, dice clattering, punctuated by bursts of laughter that ricochet off the walls. You realize quickly that every sound, every scent, every twitch of a foot has meaning here, a silent language of social rhythms coded into the very space of the kahvehane. At the far corner, an elderly man, perhaps a poet or a scholar, leans toward a young apprentice and whispers something under his breath. The apprentice chuckles nervously, tilts his cup and nods, hiding the fact that he's taken the advice seriously. You notice a pattern. Coffee houses are as much about mentorship and learning as they are about drinking. Scholars still argue whether the rise of coffee houses accelerated intellectual exchange in Ottoman cities more than formal madrasas did. But standing here, listening to the soft hum of conversation, it's hard to argue against it. And then there's the fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect. Some patrons supposedly sprinkled tiny amounts of crushed saffron or rose petals in their coffee to stimulate imagination, a practice whispered about in letters that occasionally surface in the odd archive. A young man strides in, carrying a small satchel of news from distant provinces. He sets down a folded paper on the counter and announces the day's events: a caravan delayed by rain, a minor skirmish near the Danube, the price of silk fluctuating unpredictably. You watch as the room responds. Merchants murmur, poets scribble lines inspired by the tidbit, and the old scholar's eyebrows raise ever so slightly. Coffee here isn't just a beverage, it's the catalyst for storytelling, debate, and occasionally minor rebellions wrapped in laughter. Historians still argue whether the cafes acted more as political incubators or social safaris, but either way, the smell alone makes your steps light with anticipation. You drift inside one such establishment, a low-ceilinged room crowded with benches worn smooth by years of elbows, backs, and restless feet. The air is thick with smoke from nargilés and candles, interlaced with the nutty scent of ground coffee steeping in tiny copper chesves. You can feel the warmth instantly. It's almost tangible, like the walls themselves exhale comfort. Patrons glance at you, some with mild curiosity, others with the practiced indifference of habituation. A group of merchants hunch over a game of tavla, dice clattering, punctuated by bursts of laughter that ricochet off the walls. You realize quickly that every sound, every scent, every twitch of a foot has meaning here, a silent language of social rhythms coded into the very space of the kahvehane. At the far corner, an elderly man, perhaps a poet or a scholar, leans toward a young apprentice and whispers something under his breath. The apprentice chuckles nervously, tilts his cup and nods, hiding the fact that he's taken the advice seriously. You notice a pattern. Coffee houses are as much about mentorship and learning as they are about drinking. Scholars still argue whether the rise of coffee houses accelerated intellectual exchange in Ottoman cities more than formal madrasas did. But standing here, listening to the soft hum of conversation, it's hard to argue against it. And then there's the fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect. Some patrons supposedly sprinkled tiny amounts of crushed saffron or rose petals in their coffee to stimulate imagination, a practice whispered about in letters that occasionally surface in the odd archive. A young man strides in, carrying a small satchel of news from distant provinces. He sets down a folded paper on the counter and announces the day's events: a caravan delayed by rain, a minor skirmish near the Danube, the price of silk fluctuating unpredictably. You watch as the room responds. Merchants murmur, poets scribble lines inspired by the tidbit, and the old scholar's eyebrows raise ever so slightly. Coffee here isn't just a beverage, it's the catalyst for storytelling, debate, and occasionally minor rebellions wrapped in laughter. Historians still argue whether the cafes acted more as political incubators or social safaris, but either way, the smell alone makes your steps light with anticipation. You drift inside one such establishment, a low-ceilinged room crowded with benches worn smooth by years of elbows, backs, and restless feet. The air is thick with smoke from nargilés and candles, interlaced with the nutty scent of ground coffee steeping in tiny copper chesves. You can feel the warmth instantly. It's almost tangible, like the walls themselves exhale comfort. Patrons glance at you, some with mild curiosity, others with the practiced indifference of habituation. A group of merchants hunch over a game of tavla, dice clattering, punctuated by birds. You step out of the warm, aromatic haze of the Kavahane and into the cooler, lantern-lit streets of Istanbul. The cobblestones are slick with the faint sheen of evening mist, and your footsteps echo faintly, mingling with distant calls of night watchmen and the soft braying of donkeys returning from the markets. The city feels alive in a quieter way now, like it's exhaling after the intensity of daytime commerce. You trudge along narrow alleys, the distant silhouette of minarets cutting across the twilight sky, and your senses remain alert to every small movement. A curtain fluttering, the glint of a copper tray through a doorway, the faint scent of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor's cart. The contrast between the bustling intimacy of the coffeehouse and this quieter urban sprawl is almost dizzying, a reminder that life both inside and outside those walls pulses with its own distinct rhythm. As you wander, you notice how the stories, debates, and small dramas of the coffeehouse cling to your mind. The jokes about a camel bribed with coffee, the hushed discussions of taxation, the Sufis' murmured verses, all of it feels like a layer over the city itself, invisible yet palpable. You pass an open courtyard where a few men continue a late-night game of tavla under a single lantern, and the soft click of dice momentarily grounds you in the present. Historians still argue whether these late-night gatherings contributed more to civic cohesion or merely offered distraction. But standing here, watching the players lean in and exchange sly smiles, you sense a little of both. Even the fringe rumors about secret rooftop debates, some suggesting that women recited poetry or exchanged philosophical tracts away from prying eyes, seem plausible given the intricate social choreography you've just witnessed. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mingles with the lingering coffee aroma from the cafes you passed, and your stomach rumbles faintly. You consider slipping in for a late snack, only to see a boy with a small tray of tiny sesame-coated simmets dart through the street, calling out softly. You follow the boy's rhythmic chant, weaving around pedestrians and stray animals, and pick up a single warm simmet. The sesame seeds crackle softly beneath your teeth, a satisfying complement to the bitter aftertaste of the coffee lingering on your tongue. The simple act of eating here, amid the smells, sounds, and shifting shadows, feels like a continuation of the sensory tapestry from the coffeehouse itself. You pause on a bridge, looking down at the dark water of the Golden Horn. Lanterns from ships and riverside homes reflect in the gently rippling surface, creating a fragmented, shimmering mosaic. A small group of fishermen rows quietly, their oars slicing through the water with soft, rhythmic splashes. You take a deep breath, and for a moment, the noise of the city seems to dissolve, leaving only the combined scent of water, night jasmine, and distant coffee wafting from nearby Kavahanes. Fringe accounts hint that some late-night river crossings were used for clandestine discussions, letters exchanged, messages delivered, even philosophical debates whispered beneath the stars. You imagine the conspiracies and secrets quietly threading through the city, small sparks of influence unseen by most. Further along, the streets narrow again, and you find yourself in an area with a cluster of small bookshops and manuscript stalls. Scrolls are stacked haphazardly, ink-stained hands leafing through fragile pages, and the faint smell of parchment mingles with ink and coffee smoke carried from a nearby cafe. Patrons peruse quietly, occasionally stopping to read aloud a favorite couplet or humorous anecdote, their voices mingling in the warm night air. Historians still argue whether these streets, lined with manuscripts and modest printing presses, truly accelerated intellectual exchange or simply mirrored the activity inside the coffeehouses. But walking among them, you feel the current of knowledge in the air. A faint melody reaches your ears, a lute or saz played in a nearby courtyard. You follow the sound, stepping lightly over uneven stones, and arrive at a small gathering where a few musicians sit cross-legged, plucking strings in intricate patterns. Patrons of the nearby coffeehouses occasionally drift in to listen, and the blend of music, scent, and soft murmured conversation creates a layered sensory experience. Fringe tales suggest that some musicians would improvise melodies specifically designed to enhance alertness and focus during debate, a curious blend of art and practical intention. You lean against a wall, letting the music wash over you, feeling the subtle interplay of human creativity and ambient energy that seems to define the city's nocturnal pulse. You continue wandering, guided as much by instinct as by memory, your footsteps carrying you toward a quieter district where the aroma of incense replaces that of coffee. Small courtyards open into darkened alleys, lit only by scattered lanterns. A few figures pass by, their conversations hushed, their movements deliberate. You catch snippets of poetry, philosophical musings, and quiet negotiations over trade or goods. The night feels intimate, protective, as if the city itself is shielding these late-hour interactions from prying eyes. Historians still argue whether such nocturnal strolls and encounters fostered civic dialogue or merely private entertainment, but the sensation of being enveloped by a living, breathing urban organism is undeniable. At the edge of this district, you spot a small tea stall next to a quiet kavahane. The owner is cleaning copper pots, the metal glinting in the soft lantern light, and occasionally offering a warm greeting to late-night visitors. You pause, intrigued by the gentle rhythm of routine, the same patterns you observed inside the coffeehouse, now mirrored on the streets, small gestures repeated nightly, stabilizing the social fabric. Fringe stories claim that some stall owners would secretly share news from distant cities with trusted patrons, turning even mundane acts of commerce into conduits of information. You sip from a cup of tea, feeling the warmth spread through you, a gentle counterpoint to the bitter aftertaste of the coffee you left behind. The city now breathes in slow, measured waves. You hear distant laughter from another coffeehouse, a dog barking far off, the quiet splash of water against a stone quay. You pause to take in the full panorama, the hum of life, the weaving of scents, the faint musical undertones, and the soft, persistent thread of conversation running through every corner. The city itself seems alive, a continuation of the coffeehouse's energy, flowing outward, touching every alley, courtyard, and waterway. Even as night deepens, the city's pulse persists, subtle but steady, connecting all its inhabitants in a network of shared presence and unspoken stories. You wander further, the night air carrying a delicate chill that makes the warmth from your coffeehouse visit seem almost tangible on your skin. Lanterns flicker, casting elongated shadows across the stone walls of shops long since closed. Occasionally, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifts past, mixing oddly yet satisfyingly with the remnants of coffee, spices, and incense still clinging to the air. You notice the faint scuff marks on the cobblestones, worn smooth from countless footsteps over decades, a quiet testament to the city's layered history. Each stone feels imbued with stories, a quiet witness to the endless ebb and flow of human activity. French historians suggest that some travelers could trace entire city routes merely by the way the stones had been worn. A fanciful claim, yet standing here, it doesn't seem entirely impossible. A group of late-night merchants huddle near a doorway, the warm glow of a single lantern illuminating their faces as they whisper, lean in, and gesture toward a map spread on the ground.
You can't hear the details, but you catch the intensity in their expressions, the careful choreography of leaning, nodding, and murmuring. Even at night, commerce never truly sleeps. It simply transforms, becoming more intimate, more strategic, more reliant on personal trust and shared glances. Historians still argue whether these late-night negotiations significantly impacted the flow of goods across the empire or were mostly symbolic gestures of reputation and influence. Observing it firsthand, you feel the subtle weight of power and persuasion humming quietly beneath the city's calm exterior. From a narrow alley, the faint strumming of a saz draws you closer. A young musician sits cross-legged on a worn mat, eyes closed, fingers dancing over strings as he improvises a melody that feels familiar, yet entirely new. Patrons from nearby coffeehouses occasionally drift over, some standing quietly, some swaying gently to the rhythm, all adding their silent presence to the performance. Fringe accounts claim that some musicians intentionally sync their melodies with lunar cycles or specific nights of the week to enhance patrons' alertness or mood. You sip the remaining warmth from your cup, noticing how music, smell, and movement weave into a tapestry of multi-sensory engagement, subtly guiding the city's nocturnal energy. A small dog trots past, tail wagging, stopping briefly to sniff at the edge of a fountain. The fountain gurgles softly, a steady pulse beneath the scattered lanterns and low murmurs. You crouch to watch it lap at the water, amused by the simplicity and universality of its need. The mundane acts of animals, the rhythm of water, the flicker of light, they all echo the same principles you witnessed in the coffeehouse: interconnectedness, attention, and shared presence. Fringe tales suggest that some coffeehouse patrons would observe street animals to glean omens or metaphors for debates, a belief that seems whimsical but somehow fits the subtle interweaving of ritual and observation you've been tracing all night. You pause at a small square where a few vendors still linger, their wares modest yet inviting: spices in clay jars, dried fruits piled high, copper cups polished to a warm glow.
The first pale hints of dawn begin to stain the horizon as you step into the quiet streets, and the city, though still largely asleep, hums with a subtle promise of awakening. Mist curls lazily along the cobblestones, softening the harsh angles of walls and rooftops, and the air carries a chill that makes you hug your cloak a little tighter. You notice the faint aroma of early baked bread drifting from ovens that have already been stoked, mingling with the remnants of coffee, jasmine, and incense from the night before. The soft patter of your footsteps echoes against narrow alleys, harmonizing with the occasional cooing of pigeons or distant barking dogs. As you wander, the rhythm of the morning streets feels like a continuation of the coffeehouse's nocturnal pulse, a slower, gentler version of the layered energy you left behind. Fringe accounts suggest that some early risers believed walking through the city at this hour sharpened one's mind, a subtle preparation for debate or reflection later in the day. You pause near a small square where a few merchants have begun to set up their stalls. The scent of dried fruits, nuts, and honey-coated pastries is immediate and intoxicating. You notice the careful choreography of their movements. A basket is shifted, a scale is balanced, a tray of goods arranged with meticulous care. Patrons from earlier evenings begin to drift in for a corning cup of coffee, nodding politely to the vendors, exchanging soft jokes, and remarking on news passed along during the night. Historians still argue whether these early interactions significantly influenced civic awareness or were primarily practical. But watching the subtle negotiation of attention, resources, and shared humor, it feels like a bit of both. Fringe tales claim that some coffeehouse owners began the day by reading secret missives from the previous night, blending commerce with clandestine information networks, which adds a layer of intrigue to these otherwise ordinary morning routines. The faint sound of a lute drifts from a nearby balcony, its melody delicate and measured, echoing softly in the still morning. You follow the notes, finding a musician practicing quietly, eyes half closed in concentration. A small group of apprentices watch, occasionally mimicking a chord or plucking a string, their movements careful yet tentative. Fringe stories suggest that some Sufi musicians intentionally modulated their practice sessions to enhance the contemplative state of early morning patrons, subtly influencing moods and even the quality of debate later in the day. You sip from your cup, the lingering bitterness of coffee mingling with the sweetness of a stolen pastry, and realize how seamlessly art, ritual, and human interaction intertwine in these spaces. Walking along a quieter lane, you encounter a small courtyard where a poet recites verses softly to a single attentive listener. The words are simple, yet every syllable seems charged with delicate energy. Shadows from nearby lanterns dance across the walls, and you catch the faint aroma of ink from manuscripts left open on a wooden table. Patrons of nearby coffee houses drift in and out, some pausing to listen, some merely passing through. Yet the sense of a shared intellectual and sensory space remains palpable. Scholars still debate whether these poetry readings were primarily social entertainment or serious intellectual exercise, but standing there, witnessing the attention, the subtle reactions, and the occasional nod of acknowledgement, it feels undeniably important. Fringe accounts suggest that some verses were coded, carrying philosophical or political subtexts that only attentive listeners could discern, transforming even a casual recital into an intricate web of meaning. You meander toward a small bridge overlooking a gently flowing canal. The water is calm, reflecting the first hints of sunlight in soft, flickering patterns. Fishermen begin to push off from the banks, their oars tapping lightly against wooden boats. A faint smell of salt and riverweed blends with the lingering coffee aroma, and you pause to watch a pair of ducks glide past. The movement of the water, the rhythm of oars, and the quiet murmurs of early patrons form a gentle symphony, connecting the urban pulse of streets with the natural flow of the waterway. Fringe tales suggest that some late-night or early-morning philosophers preferred observing the water for reflection, believing that its movement mirrored the ebb and flow of human thought. Historians still argue whether these observations truly informed intellectual discourse or were merely symbolic, but the serene symmetry is undeniable. From a nearby alley, you hear the soft scrape of a cart delivering firewood to a cafe. The vendor calls out gently, the sound absorbed and echoed by the surrounding walls. Patrons drift in to claim their first cup of coffee for the day, exchanging nods, smiles, and soft greetings. You notice the subtle interplay of ritual, commerce, and social bonding, the precise timing of arrivals, the careful pouring of coffee, the understated gestures of camaraderie. Fringe stories hint that certain coffeehouse owners would deliberately select seating arrangements to spark conversation or philosophical debate, a playful manipulation that nonetheless shaped the social texture of the space. You sip, letting the warmth spread through you, and marvel at the subtle choreography of human interaction unfolding in real time. The streets begin to fill gradually as more merchants, artisans, and early risers emerge. You notice a pattern. The city's rhythm is cyclical, reflecting the ebb and flow of conversation, labor, and observation you saw the night before. Small groups gather spontaneously, sharing gossip, debating news, or simply enjoying the quiet warmth of early morning coffee. Historians still debate whether these gatherings meaningfully impacted civic engagement, but you sense that the repetition of attention, ritual, and shared experience created an invisible yet palpable social glue. Fringe accounts suggest that even minor observations, such as a fleeting gesture,
the alignment of seating, or a choice of coffee cup were believed to influence the quality and tone of discussion, transforming ordinary interactions into microcosms of social negotiation. At the edge of the square, a child skips past, trailing a small hoop and stick, laughter spilling into the morning air. You smile, noticing how play and human connection intermingle seamlessly with commerce and intellectual activity. The subtle layering of sensory detail, the warmth of the coffee, the rhythmic tap of the hoop, the smell of fresh pastries, the faint notes of a lute, creates an immersive tapestry that feels almost alive. Fringe stories suggest that children were occasionally allowed into early morning discussions to provoke unfiltered commentary or fresh perspectives, a charming, if anecdotal, example of how all members of society contributed to the subtle currents of debate. You wander further, approaching a small tea stall tucked into a quiet corner. The owner greets early patrons with a nod, balancing trays of cups with ease. You notice the subtle social rules in play: polite spacing, quiet conversation, careful attention to gestures, and a gentle awareness of rhythm. Patrons sip quietly, some lost in thought, some whispering softly, all contributing to the layered experience of the morning. Historians still argue whether such spaces were primarily intellectual hubs or social convenience, but the energy, subtle and persistent, suggests a little of both. Fringe tales claim that certain secret codes or messages could be embedded in the manner in which tea or coffee was served, a whimsical but intriguing possibility that underscores the depth of engagement in these modest rituals. By mid-morning, the city feels alive, yet measured, a dance of light, aroma, sound, and human attention. You pause, absorbing the full panorama: merchants arranging goods, musicians practicing, poets reciting, children playing, artisans laboring, coffee houses and tea stalls buzzing quietly with conversation. Each thread interweaves seamlessly into the others, creating a layered, living network of interaction that extends outward across neighborhoods and streets. You realize with a faint sense of awe that the city itself is an extension of the coffee house, a continuously unfolding performance of human connection, ritual, and shared presence.
By late morning, the city has fully awakened, yet it retains the gentle intimacy that threaded through the night and early dawn. You walk along streets now bustling with a carefully orchestrated chaos. Merchants shout softly to advertise wares. Carts rattle over uneven stones, and the air is thick with the mingling scents of fresh bread, roasting chestnuts, spices, and of course, coffee that refuses to relinquish its presence. The rhythm of life feels both energetic and deliberate, as if every movement has been choreographed over generations of habit, yet remains flexible enough to allow for spontaneous debate, humor, and small human dramas. Fringe accounts suggest that some coffeehouse patrons preferred observing this daily ballet to inspire new conversation topics or even rhetorical exercises, turning mere observation into an active form of participation in the city's social fabric. You notice a group of scholars gathered near a small fountain in a square, papers and scrolls spread around them, gestures punctuating their lively conversation. The scholars lean in toward one another, eyes bright with curiosity and intensity, occasionally pausing to take a sip of coffee or adjust the angle of a manuscript. Their focus is palpable, and yet their voices carry lightly across the square, blending seamlessly with the ambient sounds of commerce and daily life. Historians still argue whether these gatherings primarily served the dissemination of knowledge or simply reinforced social hierarchies. But standing here, you sense that the interplay of intellect, ritual, and public presence forms a uniquely Ottoman urban energy. Fringe stories claim that some of these debates included coded references to distant political affairs,
allowing patrons to discuss sensitive topics without attracting unwelcome attention. A subtle dance of intellect and discretion that seems almost theatrical. A spice merchant rearranges small jars on a wooden table, each labeled in delicate script. The smell of cinnamon, clove, and cardamom mixes with the faint aroma of coffee, creating an almost intoxicating olfactory landscape. You lean in to inhale, noting how sensory detail seems to enhance social interaction in these spaces. Patrons pause mid-conversation, their gestures momentarily stilled by the vivid layering of scent, sound, and visual detail. Fringe accounts suggest that some merchants deliberately used aroma to influence mood and discussion, subtly encouraging generosity, attentiveness, or levity. Historians still debate whether these sensory manipulations were intentional cultural strategies or incidental byproducts of urban density, but you feel their effect nonetheless. As you turn into a quieter alley, the rhythmic clatter of a hammer against metal draws your attention. A small workshop has opened for the day, and artisans are bent over their craft. The steady percussion of tool meeting material, blending with the soft murmur of conversation from the street outside. You pause, fascinated by the synchronicity of manual labor and intellectual activity, and notice how passers-by glance in, sometimes offering a friendly word or observing quietly, absorbing information and stories. Fringe tales hint that some workshops included subtle lessons in rhetoric, strategy, and debate, turning labor into a classroom where the city itself became the curriculum. You sip from a cup of freshly brewed coffee, savoring the bitterness, and reflect on how seamlessly these routines, work, and communal spaces overlap. A small boy darts past, carrying a bundle of freshly baked cement, calling softly to attract early customers. You follow him for a moment, noting the subtle microeconomies unfolding in every corner, the precise placement of goods, the gentle negotiation of prices, the exchange of nods and smiles that conveys trust and social currency. Historians still argue whether these minor economic interactions had long-term cultural significance or simply necessary transactions. But watching them unfold, you see the same delicate interplay of ritual, attentiveness, and human engagement that pervades the coffee houses. Fringe accounts suggest that some vendors were rumored to act as informal news couriers, passing along bits of information from one district to another, a subtle network of communication that complements the more formal debate spaces. You pause at another small square where a few musicians practice together, a saz and a ney blending to form an intricate, improvisational soundscape. Patrons from nearby coffeehouses drift toward the square, stopping to listen, their gestures almost imperceptibly mirroring the cadence of the music. The interaction of sound, presence, and attention feels orchestrated yet natural, as if the city itself is playing a symphony of human experience. Fringe tales suggest that certain melodies were deliberately composed to provoke intellectual thought or reflection, a subtle cue to spark conversation or debate. Historians still debate the efficacy of such artistic interventions, but the impact on mood and attentiveness is unmistakable, and you find yourself momentarily suspended in the layered sensory environment. Turning another corner, you find yourself near a small tea stall tucked against a building, its owner pouring hot tea into small copper cups with methodical care. Patrons lean on the counter, exchanging news, advice, or minor gossip, all under the gentle canopy of the early sun. The slow pace of tea drinking, paired with attentive conversation, seems to mirror the rituals you observed inside the coffeehouses, a seamless continuation of communal focus and subtle performance. Fringe stories claim that some tea stall proprietors curated seating arrangements or timing to enhance conversation flow, a playful yet deliberate shaping of social dynamics. Historians still debate whether such interventions significantly influenced debate culture or were minor social embellishments, but the effect on the ambient energy is clear. You follow the subtle hum of conversation down a quieter lane, where the interplay of light and shadow creates shifting patterns on the cobblestones. You notice the faintest details: a carved inscription on a doorway, a petal caught in a puddle, or the whisper of wind through a hanging curtain. These small sensory cues, almost imperceptible, seem to guide attention, prompting reflection or minor interactions. Fringe accounts suggest that observant patrons might use these details to infer news, philosophical concepts, or even secret political allegiances. Historians still debate whether such observations played a meaningful role in urban intellectual life, but you feel the city's quiet, deliberate pulse connecting all these micro-moments. Finally, you reach a small square where merchants, artisans, and patrons converge naturally, forming a lattice of human attention and activity. Music drifts from a nearby balcony. Aromas of coffee and spices mingle, and the murmur of conversation forms a low, constant hum. You pause to absorb the rhythm. Gestures, glances, and subtle reactions all interweaving to create a living social fabric. Historians still argue whether these public spaces catalyzed innovation, debate, or civic identity, but the continuity from coffeehouse to street to workshop is undeniable. Fringe tales suggest that even minor visual cues, a hand motion, the tilt of a cup, or a flicker of a lantern, could influence conversation tone, a whimsical but plausible form of social choreography. You take a final deep breath, tasting coffee and early morning air, letting the layered impressions of sound, smell, movement, and human presence settle. The city at this hour is a living extension of the coffeehouse, attentive, ritualized, yet open to spontaneity and play. Every alleyway, bridge, stall, and bench participate in a subtle choreography of life, debate, and presence. And you feel, with a soft thrill, that you are a quiet witness to centuries of cultivated urban intimacy, a thread woven into the continuous, living tapestry of Ottoman daily life.
Midday settles over the city with a gentle insistence, the sun climbing higher and warming the cobblestones beneath your feet. You notice how the light transforms familiar textures, the grain of wooden shutters, the soft patina of copper trays, the roughness of stone walls worn smooth by generations of passers-by. The streets are busier now, merchants calling out, carts rattling over uneven stones, and artisans hammering, sawing, or shaping materials into functional art. But despite the bustle, there's an underlying rhythm, a flow that feels orchestrated yet completely natural, like the layered movements of a well-rehearsed symphony. Fringe stories suggest that some coffeehouse regulars timed their visits to coincide with this peak rhythm, claiming it enhanced both observation skills and conversational agility. Historians still debate whether this synchronicity was deliberate or an incidental consequence of urban density, but standing here, you can't help noticing the subtle alignment of daily life. You wander into a narrow alley where the aroma of roasting coffee beans mixes with the faint tang of fresh bread and the warmth of mid-morning sunlight. A small group of patrons gathers near a low fountain, gesturing animatedly while sipping from copper cups. You recognize a familiar cadence in their conversation: subtle pauses, gentle laughter, pointed glances, almost a choreography of debate and social negotiation. Fringe accounts claim that some coffeehouse patrons used intentional gestures, sip patterns, or even the placement of cups as a form of unspoken dialogue, a playful yet meaningful method of conveying agreement, disagreement, or nuance. Historians still argue whether such ritualized signaling carried real intellectual weight, but you notice how it shapes the rhythm of interaction, enhancing attentiveness and engagement. A few steps further, you encounter a small workshop where a metalworker hammers a thin sheet of copper, the rhythmic sound echoing through the alley.
Apprentices lean close, observing technique and occasionally asking questions in hushed tones. Patrons from nearby coffeehouses wander past, occasionally pausing to watch, as if the city itself is an extension of the coffeehouse debate, blending craftsmanship, observation, and conversation into a continuous stream of learning. Fringe tales suggest that some artisans' rhythmic labor was sometimes deliberately synchronized with debate sessions, a subtle way to create meditative focus or spark metaphorical inspiration. Historians still debate whether this interweaving of craft and intellectual engagement was common or exceptional, but you find the harmony undeniable. From a distant balcony, the gentle strumming of a saz drifts through the alleyway, merging with the scent of cardamom, roasting chestnuts, and the faint tang of river water. Patrons stop to listen, their gestures subtly attuned to the tempo of the music, the rise and fall of conversation, and the ambient rhythm of the city. Fringe accounts suggest that some musicians adjusted improvisation to mirror social dynamics, a playful technique to enhance attentiveness or mood. Historians still argue whether such musical interventions actively shaped debate or simply provided background ambiance. But your own senses suggest a deliberate weaving of sound, attention, and atmosphere. A small boy darts past carrying a tray of fresh simmet, calling softly to attract early customers. You follow him for a moment, observing the gentle negotiations between him and the merchants, careful pricing, nods of acknowledgement, whispered jokes, and soft laughter. These interactions, while minor in scale, mirror the larger dynamics you've seen in the coffeehouses: subtle attention, social negotiation, and the cultivation of trust and rapport. Fringe stories claim that observant patrons occasionally used these interactions as starting points for philosophical reflection or debate, turning mundane observation into intellectual exercise. Historians still debate whether these informal cues held measurable influence, but the patterns of behavior are undeniably rich and instructive. You turn a corner into a quiet square where a poet recites verses under the dappled shade of a fig tree. A small crowd listens, some sipping coffee, others simply standing, leaning slightly to catch every word. The cadence of the poem, combined with gestures, intonation, and occasional playful interruptions from listeners, creates a living rhythm of communication. Fringe tales suggest that these readings sometimes contained hidden social critiques or philosophical puzzles, intended to provoke thought or discussion among attentive listeners. Historians still argue whether the public nature of such poetry readings significantly influenced civic consciousness or intellectual culture, but the interplay of words, gesture, and attentive audience is mesmerizing. From the square, the faint hum of conversation drifts down a side alley, drawing you toward a key stall. Patrons lean on the counter, exchanging news, debating minor local disputes, and sipping hot tea with careful attention. The rituals of consumption, the measured pouring, the attentive listening, the subtle placement of cups, mirror patterns observed in coffeehouses. Fringe accounts suggest that some proprietors strategically arranged seating or served tea in specific sequences to encourage discussion, a whimsical yet deliberate shaping of social flow. Historians still debate the extent to which such interventions impacted intellectual life, but the effect on engagement and attentiveness is clear. Moving further, you notice the faint trace of incense from a nearby corner shop, where dried herbs, spices, and scented woods are meticulously arranged. Patrons pause, inhaling, gesturing, and occasionally sharing a quiet joke about the intensity of certain aromas. Fringe tales suggest that olfactory cues were believed to influence conversational tone or even philosophical perspective,
subtly guiding the energy of debate without overt intervention. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or localized eccentricities, but standing amidst the interplay of scent, light, sound, and movement, the effect on your own perception feels undeniable. The city continues to hum with a layered rhythm as midday approaches. Merchants, artisans, musicians, poets, and patrons all interact seamlessly, creating a continuous, flowing tapestry of sensory and social stimuli. Gestures, glances, and subtle cues form an invisible network, shaping conversation, influence, and the delicate rhythms of attention. Fringe accounts claim that careful observation of these patterns allowed certain coffeehouse regulars to anticipate social dynamics, debate strategies, or even minor economic shifts. Historians still debate the significance of these observations, but the patterns of interaction are undeniable, and the subtle orchestration of life and attention feels like a continuous, living experiment in human interaction. As you pause to sip from your copper cup, the warmth radiating through your hands and chest, you realize that the midday city is not separate from the coffee house. It is an extension, a living, breathing arena of observation, reflection, and subtle negotiation. Music, scent, labor, laughter, and conversation converge to create an immersive environment where every gesture, pause, or sip contributes to the collective rhythm. Fringe stories suggest that patrons sometimes left early debates only to continue pondering their arguments while wandering the streets, merging intellectual exercise with sensory experience. Historians still debate the precise impact of such mobility on public discourse, but you sense that it created a dynamic, fluid, and enduring social ecosystem that extends far beyond the walls of any single coffeehouse. You linger in the square, letting the warmth of sunlight, aroma of roasted coffee, hum of conversation, and subtle strumming of instruments settle in your mind. Each sensory detail, social interaction, and moment of attention layers upon the last, forming a complex yet harmonious tapestry of urban life. The city is alive, a continuous extension of the coffeehouse debates, blending ritual, observation, social negotiation, and intellectual engagement into a single, flowing experience. And as you take one last sip and let the subtle symphony of sound, scent, and movement wash over you, you feel the quiet thrill of being fully present in this intricate, centuries-old dance.
The afternoon sun now leans toward its zenith, casting long golden shafts across the cobblestone streets, igniting the subtle textures of the city in a warm, honeyed glow. You trudge along, hands wrapped around the comforting heat of a copper cup of coffee, noticing how shadows stretch and fold over themselves, creating miniature landscapes on walls, roofs, and uneven pavement. The city pulses with life, but retains the quiet, attentive rhythm that has carried you from the night's coffeehouse debates through morning and midday wanderings. Fringe tales suggest that some coffeehouse regulars claimed these shifting patterns of light influenced the tone and depth of conversation, lending themselves to moments of heightened reflection or particularly sharp argument. Historians still argue whether this was anecdotal whimsy or a deliberate observation of environmental cues, but standing here, you can almost feel the subtle choreography of attention orchestrated by sun, shadow, and human interaction. You approach a cluster of street performers, a pair of acrobats twirling with improbable precision, a young boy juggling small copper cups, and a musician plucking a delicate tune on a saz. Patrons gather, some sipping coffee while perched on benches, others leaning casually against shop fronts,
their gazes alternating between spectacle and one another, drawing subtle laughter, surprise, or gentle applause. Fringe accounts suggest that coffeehouse patrons frequently timed debates to coincide with such performances, believing that the heightened sensory engagement sharpened wit, attention, and rhetorical agility. Historians still debate whether these interwoven spectacles meaningfully influenced public discourse, but the effect on your own senses is undeniable. Every gesture, sound, and glance feeds into the continuous flow of observation and cognition. A spice merchant calls softly, inviting passers-by to inspect jars of cardamom, saffron, and clove. You lean closer, inhaling the pungent yet comforting aroma. Patrons nearby exchange nods and murmurs about quality, price, and minor tips for preparation, creating a quiet but rich tapestry of commerce and social interaction. Fringe stories suggest that subtle cues in these transactions, an exaggerated nod, the careful placement of coins, were sometimes deliberately used to provoke reflection or playful debate among attentive coffeehouse regulars. Historians still argue whether such micro-interactions genuinely influenced intellectual culture or were mere social seasoning. But observing them now, you can see how ritual, attention, and minor gestures weave seamlessly into urban life. Moving down a quieter alley, you notice a small courtyard where a few poets sit cross-legged on mats, whispering verses to one another. Their words flow like water, sometimes playful, sometimes dense with meaning, occasionally punctuated by soft laughter. Fringe tales claim that some verses contained layered allegories or philosophical puzzles designed to test the subtle perceptiveness of listeners or provoke indirect social commentary. Historians still debate whether these poetic exchanges contributed to broader cultural or political discourse, but the intimacy of the moment, the care with which each word is chosen, and the attentiveness of listeners reveal an unmistakable pattern. Debate, reflection, and social engagement do not need formal walls. They breathe wherever people gather. From the courtyard, a faint clatter draws your attention. A small blacksmith shop, its door slightly ajar, revealing apprentices and masters hammering in rhythm. Sparks leap from glowing metal, echoing against walls, creating a visual and auditory cadence that somehow complements the musical undertones drifting from nearby balconies. You pause, noting how the physical labor, sound, and movement form a symbiotic backdrop for debate and observation elsewhere in the neighborhood. Fringe stories suggest that the rhythmic labor of craftsmen was sometimes observed by coffeehouse regulars seeking metaphorical inspiration or cognitive focus, turning mundane activity into an intellectual lens. Historians still argue whether such interconnections were common features of Ottoman urban life or exceptional anecdotes. But you feel the subtle pulse of thought and attention flowing through these layers of experience. A spice merchant calls softly, weaving through the crowd, balancing a tray with dexterity, calling out softly. Patrons purchase bread, offer gentle jokes, and exchange a few words about the day's events. The minor negotiations, gestures, and attentiveness mirror the patterns you've already observed in coffeehouses, workshops, and squares, each a microcosm of social intelligence, subtle influence, and communal rhythm. Fringe accounts suggest that some early morning or late afternoon vendors were considered informal information brokers, transmitting news, opinion, or subtle gossip to patrons who could integrate it into debate or social strategy. Historians still debate the scale and significance of this phenomenon, but the intricate interconnection of commerce, observation, and social attention is undeniable. You turn into a sun-dappled square where a small ensemble plays an improvisational melody. Patrons pause mid-conversation to listen, some subtly mirroring the rhythm with finger taps, soft hums, or gentle shifts in posture. The interplay between music and social attention is intricate. Gestures, glances, and silences blend with melody to create a shared attentional space. Fringe stories suggest that certain musical phrases were deliberately designed to provoke contemplation or subtly shape debate dynamics. Historians still debate whether these acoustic interventions meaningfully influenced discourse, but the effect in the fluid, attentive energy that ripples outward across the square is undeniable. Nearby, a tea stall hums with quiet activity. Patrons lean on counters, exchanging advice, news, and minor commentary, while the measured pour of tea into copper cups punctuates the rhythm of conversation. Fringe accounts claim that coffeehouse and tea stall owners occasionally orchestrated seating arrangements or timed service to encourage debate, social reflection, or playful intrigue. Historians still debate whether these interventions shaped intellectual life significantly or merely contributed subtle social cohesion, but the palpable attentiveness and interweaving of ritual, observation, and gesture suggest a deliberate, living choreography. You follow a winding lane toward a small bridge overlooking a canal. The water sparkles in the afternoon sun, reflecting fragmented images of nearby buildings, passing boats, and the occasional flitting bird. You pause, noting the gentle murmur of water blending with distant conversation, music, and the clatter of commerce, a symphony of layered urban life. Fringe tales suggest that the observers of the canal believed the movement of water mirrored the flow of ideas and conversation, a subtle metaphorical cue that guided reflection or argument. Historians still debate whether such interpretations held meaningful sway or were eccentric cultural practices. But standing here, you can feel the interconnectedness of physical, social, and intellectual currents in the city. As afternoon ripples into early evening, the energy subtly shifts. Merchants close stalls for brief respite. Children dart through the shadows of narrow alleys, and music softens in tone. Yet the pulse of attentive presence, layered observation, and subtle social choreography continues unabated. You sip from your cup, savoring the bittersweet warmth, and reflect on how the city, the coffee houses, and all the micro-interactions form an intricate, living network that seems to breathe with its own logic. Fringe stories claim that experienced patrons could read the rhythms of the streets and anticipate patterns of debate, humor, or attention. Historians still argue the extent to which these patterns influenced public discourse or intellectual life, but the depth of coordination, observation, and subtle interaction is evident to any keen observer. Pausing on a low stone wall, you look out across the square, absorbing sunlight, sound, scent, and human presence. The city at this hour is alive, yet intimate, a complex, continuous extension of the coffeehouse. The sun now tilts lower, casting a soft amber glow across the city, and stretching the shadows of minarets, merchant stalls, and passers-by. You trudge along the uneven stones, feeling the warmth from the day lingering underfoot, the copper cup in your hands radiating a comforting heat. The air carries a layered aroma, roasting coffee beans, the faint tang of bread cooling on windowsills, and a subtle sweetness from distant baklava shops. The city hums with a rhythm that is both persistent and ephemeral, as if every element, Sound, smell, motion, and gesture participates in an invisible orchestration of attention and interaction. Fringe accounts suggest that coffeehouse patrons intentionally timed their wanderings to absorb these mid to late afternoon sensory layers, believing they sharpened wit, observation, and rhetorical finesse. Historians still debate whether such practices were common, intentional, or anecdotal, but standing here, you can sense the subtle choreography unfolding. A group of scholars gathers near a fountain in a quiet square, their papers and manuscripts spread across a low stone ledge. You lean in, noting the cadence of their conversation, a deliberate pause, a gentle smile, a pointed glance, each communicating as much as words themselves. Fringe accounts suggest that coffeehouse patrons sometimes use these signals as cues for agreement, dissent, or subtle elaboration, effectively embedding a silent dimension into debates. Historians still argue whether such micro-rituals significantly shaped discourse, but observing them now, the interplay of gesture, expression, and attentiveness is unmistakable. A nearby spice vendor meticulously arranges small jars of saffron, cardamom, and clove. Patrons pause, inhale, and exchange murmured observations about aroma and quality. You notice the delicate choreography of attention, small nods, measured gestures, whispered advice, and the rhythmic exchange of coins and goods. Fringe accounts suggest that attentive observers could read subtle social cues to infer mood, alliances, or even philosophical stance. Historians still debate the accuracy and impact of such reading skills, but their presence underscores how ritual, sensory awareness, and attention intertwine seamlessly with the daily life of the city. From a nearby balcony, soft saws music drifts downward, blending with the hum of conversation and the distant hammering of artisans at work. Patrons occasionally pause, gestures mirroring musical cadences, eyes glinting with subtle amusement or contemplation. Fringe stories claim that coffeehouse regulars would use these musical interruptions to redirect debates, test attentiveness, or frame playful rhetorical challenges. Historians still argue whether these practices were formalized or spontaneous, but standing here, you can feel the subtle interweaving of sound, attention, and social exchange shaping the urban experience. A boy darts past, balancing a tray of freshly baked cement. You follow him for a moment, noting the delicate negotiation of minor exchanges, careful placement of coins, nods of acknowledgement, whispered pleasantries. Each transaction, however small, mirrors the social and intellectual attentiveness cultivated in the coffeehouses, a constant calibration of observation, empathy, and subtle influence. Fringe accounts suggest that these seemingly mundane interactions occasionally served as informal information networks, passing tidbits of news or opinion between neighborhoods. Historians still debate the scale and significance of such networks, but observing them now, the depth of coordination and attentiveness is palpable. You meander into a quiet courtyard where a small ensemble of poets and musicians gathers. The poets exchange verses, punctuated by gentle laughter, while musicians improvise, their melodies weaving through the space. Patrons gather on benches, leaning in with soft gestures, adjusting posture and gaze as if to follow the unspoken rhythm of thought and sound. Fringe tales suggest that some verses and improvisations contained layered allegories or playful philosophical puzzles designed to subtly challenge or provoke attentive listeners. Historians still argue whether these practices significantly shaped public thought or intellectual culture, but the intimacy and intensity of attention are unmistakable. Nearby, a blacksmith hammers heated metal, sparks flying rhythmically. Apprentices observe closely, absorbing both technique and tacit lessons in patience, rhythm, and focus. Patrons of nearby coffeehouses glance through open doors, sometimes integrating the visual and auditory patterns into their own thought processes or debates. Fringe stories suggest that the rhythmic labor of artisans was intentionally used as a cognitive stimulant for those seeking reflection or metaphorical insight. Historians still debate whether such cross-contextual influence was deliberate or coincidental, but the effect on ambient attentiveness is undeniable. You pause at a tea stall tucked into a corner, watching patrons lean on counters, exchange minor gossip, and sip steaming cups with careful attention. The slow, measured gestures of pouring, lifting, and tasting punctuate conversation, creating a quiet rhythm that mirrors coffeehouse debate culture. Fringe accounts claim that tea stall proprietors sometimes orchestrated seating and service patterns to subtly encourage dialogue or reflection. Historians still argue the prevalence and impact of these interventions, but the seamless layering of ritual, observation, and social flow is evident to anyone attuned to the environment. From a nearby shop, a faint waft of incense mingles with the scent of coffee and baked goods. Patrons pause, inhale, and exchange small nods and resume conversation. Fringe stories suggest that such olfactory cues were used to influence mood or cognitive engagement, subtly enhancing attentiveness or shaping debate tone. Historians still debate the extent to which these practices were meaningful or anecdotal, but the multisensory layering contributes unmistakably to the city's immersive social and intellectual ecosystem. The city now begins to shift toward early evening. The sun dips lower, the warmth softens, and shadows deepen. Merchants close for brief resort, children play in fading light, and the gentle hum of conversation persists, now tinged with a subtle reflective quality. You sip from your copper cup, savoring the bittersweet warmth, and notice how the interplay of gesture, sound, aroma, and movement continues unabated. Fringe accounts suggest that seasoned coffeehouse patrons could anticipate debate dynamics, social nuance, and conversation flow, integrating these insights into both formal and informal interactions. Historians still debate the scale and significance of such perceptive practices, but the richness of layered attentiveness, ritual, and human coordination is clear and compelling. Finally, you pause at the edge of a small square, leaning against a low wall, letting the ambient rhythm of the city, the fading sunlight, the aroma of coffee, and the murmur of conversation settle into your consciousness. The Ottoman urban landscape is alive with subtle orchestration. Every gesture, glance, note, and scent contributes to an intricate, continuous dialogue that extends the essence of coffeehouse debate into the streets, workshops, and squares of the city. You take a long sip of coffee, feeling warmth radiate through your hands and chest, and appreciate the quiet, intricate choreography of observation, attention, and social engagement that surrounds you, a living, breathing extension of centuries-old intellectual culture.
Hey guys, tonight we drift out into an ocean so wide it eats the edges of thought. You're lying on the woven deck of a Polynesian canoe, the air still thick with dawn, your breath sinking with the slow heartbeat of the sea. The horizon looks empty, but it isn't. Beneath that shimmer of silver lies a world of signs, a pulse in the water, a slant in the light, a promise of direction written in movement itself. You probably won't survive this trip, not because it's perilous, but because somewhere between the salt and the silence, the version of you that thinks of maps as paper might quietly drown. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You rise to your feet, balance uncertain, the deck creaking under you like an old chest lid.
Around you, the ocean glows with the early light, each ripple catching the sun in tiny fragments. The navigator standing nearby, the tautai, or wayfinder, doesn't look down at any compass. He simply narrows his eyes toward the horizon, as if reading a secret text stretched flat across the sea. You follow his gaze and realize that the water isn't uniform. It bends and breathes. The swell under your canoe has a direction, a rhythm, almost a handwriting. For the people who once crossed thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean in canoes barely the width of your car, the sea itself was the map. No parchment, no magnetic north, only the feel of waves striking the hull, the sound of water against wood, the taste of salt carried from distant islands. Each island leaves a different signature on the sea, a blend of swells, currents, and wind patterns. The experienced navigator could sense that signature long before land appeared. You close your eyes, trying to feel it. There's a long swell from the southeast, steady and deep, the background rhythm of the trade winds. Then, overlaying it, a faint cross swell, a gentler pulse from the north. The navigator names them, Telapa, Ka'alahua, patterns invisible to the untrained eye. To you, it's just motion. To him, it's a paragraph of direction. Historians still argue whether early voyagers relied more on these wave patterns or on celestial navigation, but everyone agrees that the mastery of ocean swells was no less than a language. A historical fact slips in here. The Polynesians reached islands across an area covering more than 10 million square miles, larger than Europe, Asia, and Africa combined. Long before Columbus ever misplaced the Bahamas for India, they were moving intentionally between far-flung islands, guided by knowledge passed mouth to mouth, star to star. Their maps weren't drawn, they were memorized through chants and gestures. One of those chants, still whispered in parts of Micronesia, describes swells as living beings. Quote, "The mother swell rocks the child current, and together they cradled the canoe." A little quirky? Sure. But think about it. If you lived your life on water, you'd start giving it family names too. The sea would stop being it and start being her, or them, or that cousin who sometimes flips your boat. You kneel at the bow, hand trailing in the foam. The navigator grins and points toward a faint discoloration in the water, a shift from blue-black to milky turquoise. He says, "See that? A shallow ridge below." You realize he's right. The ocean here smells slightly different, tangier, full of stirred sand. Without sonar or satellites, he's reading the color of depth. Polynesian navigators cataloged over 30 distinct shades of ocean blue, each hinting at a certain depth, type of seabed, or even proximity to land. And yet they never wrote this down. To learn was to sail, to feel, to fail, and to try again. One wrong read could mean hundreds of miles off course, which out here meant goodbye. But there's an odd detail you wouldn't expect. Some wayfinders claimed they could hear islands. On still nights, when air and sea flattened, they said the ocean carried a faint echo of surf breaking on distant reefs. Modern scientists scoff, then whisper that maybe, just maybe, under certain acoustic conditions, low-frequency sound might travel farther than we assume. It's the kind of idea that sounds mystical until physics winks at you. You sit down, letting the canoe rock beneath you. The navigator dips his paddle once, twice, not to steer, but to feel. He explains that every island warps the rhythm of surrounding waves, creating interference patterns that can be felt, like overlapping ripples in a pond when you drop two stones. The ocean becomes a tactile chart. The canoe becomes your fingertip tracing it. He gestures at the sky, though it's still daylight. He says, "Later, the stars will confirm what the waves already tell you." You nod, but your mind lingers on the idea that knowledge here isn't visual alone. It's full body. You don't read the sea. You listen to it with your skin. A small flying fish leaps beside you, catching sunlight before vanishing again. The navigator chuckles. He's late to his meeting. It's your first joke at sea, and it feels strangely right. Humor out here is how you keep the fear at bay. The vastness is too big to face without a smirk. As the day stretches, the canoe cuts across invisible highways of current. You learn that these highways shift with seasons, winds, and El Niño cycles. Some navigators could predict weather by the taste of humidity or the smell of rain 100 miles away. Skeptical? Try living generations on boats. You'd learn too. At sunset, the ocean's texture changes. The long swells slow, flattening into something almost expectant. The navigator nods approvingly. He says, "We're in the lee of land now," though no island is visible. Somewhere beyond that golden haze lies your first destination, drawn not by lines on paper, but by pulse and pattern, color and calm. You finally understand that maps are conveniences for those on land. Out here, they're unnecessary clutter. The world itself is already annotated, if you learn to read it. The night cools, and the sea sighs around you like a giant turning in its sleep. The navigator hums softly, a chant that rises and falls with the waves, syncing his mind with their rhythm. You let your own breath match his melody, and for a fleeting moment, the boundary between you and the ocean disappears. You're no longer traveling through the sea. You're part of it, part of a lineage that measured distance not in miles, but in heartbeats and trust. And as stars begin to flicker into view above the fading horizon, the next lesson awaits, glittering in the dark, like memory itself.
Night folds over the canoe like velvet, thick and warm, and for the first time, the ocean feels truly endless. The air smells faintly of salt and breadfruit ash from the fire you left behind, far beyond the horizon. The navigator sits cross-legged at the stern, eyes fixed on the sky as if it were an old story he's memorized. You tilt your head back too, and suddenly the stars don't look random anymore. They look organized, deliberate, like someone spilled diamonds but then rearranged them out of guilt. The Milky Way arches above you, a river of light. The navigator calls it Te Ikaroa, the long fish. In his world, that band of glitter isn't just scenery, it's a coordinate system. He traces his finger upward. That, he says softly, is your road tonight. You squint, but there are too many stars, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Your city-trained eyes can't even tell which ones matter. He smiles as if reading your thoughts. He says, "You don't need them all. You just need the ones that stay true." The Polynesian sky was divided into star houses, imaginary rising and setting points along the horizon. Each star had its time to appear, its time to vanish, and the navigator memorized them like verses in a hymn. As a star rose, you steered toward it. When it set, you shifted your heading toward the next. Simple in theory, brutal in practice, because the sea doesn't hold still while you're busy admiring Orion's belt. Historians still argue whether navigators used fixed star compasses or relied on rhythmic memory, chanted sequences of celestial bodies tied to songs of paddling or breath. Either way, the system worked. When Western explorers like Cook and Magellan were bumbling through the Pacific with sextants and celestial tables. Polynesian navigators had already crisscrossed it for centuries, using only their eyes, their minds, and the sky. You watch the navigator raise his arm, hand flat, aligning stars along his knuckles. Your horizon line, he murmurs, is your ruler. He shows you how the distance between two bright points can mark degrees of latitude in a way no modern app could simplify. His eyes flick to the left. That's Hokulea, he says, the star of gladness, what you might call Arcturus. She points to Hawaii. It's a lovely moment of orientation until you realize he's using her pronouns. Stars, in this worldview, are relatives, companions, not coordinates. They have moods, personalities, even moral expectations. One navigator might refuse to sail if a certain star rose at the wrong angle, seeing it as a warning. You imagine trying to explain that to a travel insurance agent. Still, the relationship between human and cosmos here feels strangely personal. The navigator isn't just looking at the sky, he's in conversation with it. When a faint wisp of cloud crosses Hokulea, he pauses mid-sentence, as though listening. Then he nods, adjusts the sail slightly, and continues humming. You ask what he saw. He shrugs. She winked. You grin. That's your data input? He laughs, the kind of low, quiet laugh that makes you feel small but safe. You call it data. I call it noticing. It's not mystical, you realize. It's training. Generations of people memorized the sky until it became muscle memory. Each star's rise and set matched a point on the horizon known as a kinda, a home. By linking celestial motion to geography, navigators could hold a mental atlas that rotated with them as they moved. It's like running Google Maps entirely inside your brain, but the battery never dies. There's a fringe detail scholars whisper about. Some navigators reportedly used the faint color shift of starlight near the horizon to gauge humidity and weather changes. That's borderline superhero stuff, except astronomers now admit that atmospheric refraction can slightly tint stars redder or bluer depending on conditions. Maybe ancient navigators didn't just imagine it, maybe they actually read micro-changes in the color spectrum with naked eyes trained over decades. As the hours drift by, the sea smooths out to glass. The canoe barely whispers across it. The navigator leans forward and murmurs another name, Te Piringa o Te Tai, the gathering of the seas. You realize he's not just talking about water now. He's talking about alignment, the meeting of wave, wind, and starlight into a single readable language. For every new constellation, he has a story. The Southern Cross is a stingray's tail. Orion's belt becomes 3 fishhooks. The stories aren't quaint, they're mnemonic devices. You realize that mythology here isn't superstition, it's an efficient hard drive. Each myth encodes a pattern, a direction, a season, a warning. Forget the story, and you forget how to go home. You lean back, letting the wind brush your face, and try to memorize the same shapes. You fail instantly. Your brain, soaked in modern convenience, rebels at this kind of labor. So you cheat. You make your own constellation, naming 3 bright stars after your favorite snacks. The navigator glances at your pointing finger and chuckles. Those are fine companions, he says, but they won't bring you back if you get lost. He has a point. Out here, lost isn't an existential metaphor. It's a very real condition with no Wi-Fi. At midnight, he stands and stretches, the stars wheeling behind him. Every night, he explains, the sky moves slightly earlier. If you know which star belongs to which month, you know your season. In other words, timekeeping is navigation too. The whole system breathes, space and time intertwined, as stars as calendar and compass in one. It's humbling. You remember that old school assignment where you had to find the North Star. That single task took you 20 minutes and a Google search. These people memorized hundreds, and they passed it down orally, generation after generation, without a single note scribbled anywhere. There's a historical footnote you can't shake. In 1976, when the double-hulled canoe Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional navigation, safely after 34 days guided purely by stars, wind, and wave feel, the skeptics went quiet. The ocean, it seemed, still recognized its old readers. The night deepens, and the line between stars and water blurs. The sea mirrors the sky perfectly, a twin universe shimmering beneath you. The navigator leans over and whispers, "Now you see why we call it the Sky Road. Above and below, it's the same path." You test it. You look down, and sure enough, the reflection of the stars shivers across the dark surface, making it impossible to tell which way is truly up. It's dizzying, hypnotic. You understand how, in the old days, wayfinders would enter trance-like focus during night travel, half meditation, half mathematics. A light joke flickers through your mind. So basically, they invented Zen and GPS in the same canoe. The navigator pretends not to hear, but the corner of his mouth twitches. Sometime before dawn, the eastern horizon begins to pale. Stars fade like forgotten dreams. The long fish thins into mist. The navigator lowers his hand. "Now we trust what we've learned," he murmurs. The stars sleep. The ocean speaks again. You lie back, eyelids heavy, the last of the constellations sliding behind morning's edge. Somewhere between wakefulness and dream, you feel the canoe tilt slightly. The navigator adjusts the sail without looking. He doesn't need to. Every gust, every sparkle, every ripple is a sentence he can read. And as sunlight returns, painting the sea gold, you realize something unsettling. This isn't navigation, it's literacy, an ability to read a language most of the world forgot. You blink against the brightening sky, where only one last star clings to visibility, trembling above the horizon like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, elegant sentence. The navigator smiles faintly. She says, "We're on course."
The morning swells roll in slow and deliberate, like the ocean is stretching after a long night's watch. You blink salt from your eyelashes and feel the rhythm underneath the canoe, a deep, rolling heartbeat that's older than memory itself. The stars are gone now, hidden behind daylight, but the navigator hasn't lost his map. He's just shifted languages. Last night the sky spoke, now the sea whispers. He crouches low, one palm pressed against the hull, eyes closed. The canoe rocks slightly, as though breathing with him. Then he points off to starboard. "You feel that?" he asks. You don't, at least not yet. The surface looks calm, the same soft quilt of blue stretching forever. But the navigator grins, patient as a teacher with a slow student. "There's another swell underneath," he says, "crossing this one. It's not wind, it's land." You raise an eyebrow. Land? From a wave? He nods. Every island sends its voice through the water. It sounds poetic, and maybe a little unhinged, but he means it literally. When waves strike an island or reef, they reflect back subtle counterwaves, long, low undulations that mingle with the regular ocean swell. To an untrained sailor, they're imperceptible. To a wayfinder, they're as clear as road signs. The sea isn't chaotic at all. It's layered, patterned, humming with meaning. You lie down and press your palm to the wooden deck, mimicking him. The vibrations are faint, so faint you think you might be imagining them. But then the navigator adjusts your hand slightly. There, A second pulse, softer, slower, coming from a slightly different direction. "That's the island's echo," he says quietly. "Still many days away." A mainstream historical fact slides in here. In the Marshall Islands, navigators once built rebelebreb, stick charts made from curved coconut fibers representing wave refraction patterns. The sticks crossed where swells met, forming a tactile diagram of invisible geography. Outsiders dismissed them as symbolic art until modern oceanographers confirmed their accuracy. You imagine those ancient sailors tracing fingers along the sticks in the dark, memorizing the field before setting out. Now, out here, you're living that chart in motion. The navigator explains that different swells have personalities. The dominant one, driven by the trade winds, comes from the east. It's broad-shouldered, dependable. Another, gentler swell slides up from the south, generated by storms in faraway latitudes. And somewhere beneath it all, a faint third rhythm, too subtle for your landlocked brain, reveals a distant island's presence. He calls this one Ka Lehua, the flower wave, beautiful, fleeting, easy to lose if you don't listen. It's humbling. You spent years trusting machines, GPS, compasses, maps printed on glossy paper, and here, a man can tell you your coordinates from the way his canoe breathes. You ask if this method ever fails. He shrugs. Sometimes the sea is quiet. Sometimes she lies. Historians still argue whether these wave readings were truly reliable over long distances or just romanticized folklore. But the record of successful voyages suggests otherwise. When explorers in the 20th century challenged modern Polynesian wayfinders to navigate without instruments, they reached their targets with stunning precision. Science, at last, caught up to intuition. A quirky bit of lore drifts in. Some old navigators claim to see waves at night through phosphorescence, the faint glow of plankton stirred by motion. By watching the streaks of light curve under starlight, they said they could trace overlapping wave paths. Whether that's scientifically provable or not, you can imagine it. The ocean lit faintly from within, a living chart glowing blue beneath your canoe. It's half myth, half science, entirely mesmerizing. The navigator shifts his weight, eyes fixed on the horizon. He murmurs, "Waves are like gossip. They tell you what happened far away." You laugh softly. "So the sea is basically the world's nosiest neighbor?" He chuckles. "She's also the most honest. She repeats what she hears exactly." The canoe glides forward, its movement guided by rhythm more than steering. Every few minutes, the navigator tests the angle of the main swell with his knees. You notice he never looks down at the water. He feels it through his body. The canoe becomes an extension of his senses, like a stethoscope pressed to the chest of the ocean. By midday, the sky is clear and pitiless. Heat shimmers. The horizon trembles in the haze. You start to lose your sense of direction entirely. Everything looks the same. Blue above, blue below, and no comforting line between them. It's disorienting. And maybe that's the point. To read this world, you have to surrender to it first. You remember a modern debate. Some researchers argue that navigators use not just waves, but also long-distance swell interference, a kind of standing wave pattern detectable by body sensation rather than sight. Others think it's impossible, that humans aren't that sensitive. Yet as your body rocks with the canoe, you start to feel something. A faint, rhythmic tug deep in your core, like the ocean is breathing through you. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's resonance. Either way, it's oddly soothing. The navigator interrupts your thoughts. "You feel that crossbeat?" he asks. "The one that comes from your left side?" You nod. "That's our island calling back. If it fades by sunset, we're drifting off course." It's absurdly simple, and profoundly complicated all at once. You watch as he adjusts the sail, barely a hand's width. The canoe's motion shifts, harmonizing the competing swells into a smoother rhythm. Balanced, restored.
He tells you that apprentices would spend years learning to detect these subtle cues, first by sight, then by touch, then by instinct. You must learn with your bones. If your mind tries too hard, you'll miss it. You can't help but laugh. So don't think too much. Got it. I've been preparing for that my whole life. He grins. Good. You'll make a navigator yet. The afternoon drifts by in a hypnotic blur of light and rhythm. You find yourself counting the waves, losing track, then counting again. There's something meditative about it, like the ocean is teaching you to slow down, to notice smaller things. The slap of water against the hull becomes punctuation in an endless conversation. A distant patch of sea shimmers differently, smoother, brighter. The navigator squints. See that? He says. That's a wind shadow. There's an atoll under that. You stare harder, but to you it's just water on water. Still, you take his word for it. Hours later, when the faint outline of land finally ghosts into sight, exactly where he said it would, you nearly forget to breathe. He just smiles. Not smug, but serene. He says, the ocean never hides her truth, only her timing. As the sun begins to sink, the waves lengthen, the swells deepening into long rhythmic motions that cradle the canoe like a cradle. You feel small, but connected, suspended between sky and sea, surrounded by movement, yet utterly still inside. Somewhere, deep below, a whale calls, a long, mournful note that ripples up through the hull. He closes his eyes and listens. Even he knows where he's going, he whispers. You don't ask how he knows that. Some things you just accept. By the time night threatens again, you've stopped trying to read the sea. You've started to listen instead. Each crest and trough feels like breath. Each shift of water against the hull feels like punctuation in a story too vast for paper. When the navigator finally says, "Now the sky will speak again," you almost don't want it to. The waves have begun to make sense, if not logically, then spiritually. But he grins, sensing your thought. Don't worry, he says. The sea and the sky tell the same story. They just use different voices. And as twilight gathers, painting silver paths across the water, you realize who's right. The ocean is still talking. You've just learned the first few words.